Again, my name is Randy Alper. I work with the California Air Resources Board, have done so successfully for about 28 and a half years. I spent a lot of time working as an enforcement officer and doing a lot of outreach because I understand the regulations fairly well and have some ability to give these presentations. Today's session is course number 505. We'll be talking about the Large Spark Ignition, or LSI, Engine Fleet Regulation. The class itself is not a very long class, it takes about an hour, and we will be covering these areas. I'm going to briefly discuss the need for the emission reductions. I'll go through the regulatory background. It does have a fairly long history. I'll talk about who the rule applies to, give you the actual requirements, and then we'll spend a bit of time talking about reporting and labeling. I'll finish up with the record-keeping requirements and a little bit of enforcement talk, and then give you some resources and contact information in case you have further questions. Well, first things first, I like to use a slide like this. There are several different versions of this for every pollutant, and they come out every year. In fact, the 2018 report is probably out. I just got to change this out. But what you're really looking at is information that's collected throughout the United States on air monitoring sites like the one pictured. The air monitoring sites draw in ambient air 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and they monitor for a variety of pollutants. That information is collected by government agencies and at some point makes it to the federal government databases, where it's then public information. And one of the organizations that use this public information is the American Lung Association. They use it to create a report every year they call the State of the Air. And that report does this. It takes a look at the top 300 metropolitan areas in the United States based on population and looks to see how many times each of those locations that they've selected gets a reading of a particular pollutant that is considered unsafe to breathe. Now for ozone, which is what this shows, the unsafe measurement or the limitation is an 8 hours, 80 parts per billion over an 8-hour period. And what you're actually looking at here are the top 10 worst places in the country to live based on the number of times there was an exceedance above 80 parts per billion on an 8-hour period. And what stands out is that California is winning the contest. It's not something that we're really proud of. It's not something that we want, and it's something that this rule that we're going to discuss has the potential to change, at least in some respects. Because the pollutants that we're talking about coming from the LSI category are primarily ones that will affect the ozone formation and cause spikes. So in any case, that's why we're doing this, that's why this rule is in place, and I just want to give you an idea of where we are as a state. Let's talk about the background of this regulation. This is not a new regulation. In fact, it's been around since 1998. In 1998, it wasn't so much a rule for people that already owned equipment as it was a measure to require manufacturers of this type of equipment to clean the engines up. So it was a new engine standard and set very limited test procedures. It was an effort to meet the federal ambient air quality standards, and the actual phase-in requirement was that by 2004, so it was a fairly long period of time, the engine manufacturers could not produce an engine in this category that put out more than 3 grams per brake horsepower hour of a hydrocarbon NOx mixture. That is literally a 75% reduction from what the starting point was. We stayed that way until 2006. The manufacturers met the standard, and then in 2006 we went back into the rule and we did a couple things. We adjusted the standard so that it required the manufacturers to make even cleaner engines, say 2 grams per brake horsepower hour by 2007, and 0.6 grams per brake horsepower hour by 2010, which ultimately was a 95% reduction. It also allowed for people who had existing equipment to install retrofit kits, because in this amendment, we also instituted fleet requirements. So now, instead of just being a fleet emissions requirement, it was if you already owned the equipment, we were going to make you meet a fleet average. And in order to do that, you might have to clean up your existing equipment. Stayed that way until 2010. And in 2010, it was just about the fleet requirements. There were no more reductions in emissions required on the manufacturer side. We added some new definitions, which I'll go over a little bit later. We also added a new category of, fleet or vehicles for airport ground support equipment and definitions in that regard. We reinstated some limited hours of use because they were taken out from the previous rule, the previous version, and we put in a compliance period that went into 2013-2014 timeframe. It became law in 2011. Prior to that, it was just regulation, and we actually were given permission by federal EPA to do enforcement and to make the requirements law over the entire state in 2012. Then it stayed that way until 2016. And in 2016, we did two things. We established reporting and labeling requirements, and then again extended the record-keeping dates. Now, here's the issue that I usually bring up in class when I'm talking about this, and that is that prior to 2016, this rule had requirements on fleet owners as well as fleet renters, and we'll discuss all those, but it really didn't have any record-keeping requirements, or I should say that. It didn't have any registration requirements or labeling requirements in it. And from an enforcement standpoint, that means it's unenforceable. So our enforcement division, working with MSCD, the Mobile Source Control Division of the Air Resources Board, requested that we add those requirements in so that this could be an enforceable regulation, which is why the 2016 amendments were even put in place. We'll be talking about the entire rule as well as the amendments, but the only thing that happened in 2016 was a requirement for registration and reporting. Now, in order to determine whether or not you will have to do anything under the terms of this regulation, you need to know who it applies to. And we're talking about anybody that owns the equipment. The applicability never changed from the previous version of the rule. It doesn't matter who owns it, if you're a business, an individual, or a government agency. What matters is the type of equipment. And the type of equipment we're dealing with is primarily large spark ignition LSI engines or electric motors. And the type of units that these engines or motors are used in that fall under this rule are forklifts, industrial tow tractors, something called a sweeper scrubber, and then airport ground support equipment, or GSE. Now, first you need to know what LSI is. And I like to think of this as any kind of fuel that runs an internal combustion except diesel. So if it's gasoline, propane, compressed natural gas, or anything other than diesel, it probably runs on something that uses a spark plug, which is spark ignition, and if it's large enough, it'll fall under this regulation. Again, in order to fall under this regulation, you still need to know what the engine has to meet as far as the standard. Now, it has to be equal to or greater than 25 horsepower, and it has to have at least 1 liter, or at least 1 liter better than 1 liter displacement. So that's an and. That means both things have to apply. And I've seen engines that are more than 25 horsepower, but less than 1 liter displacement. I've seen engines that are less than 25 horsepower and more than 1 liter displacement. Both things have to be true in order for it to fall under this rule. And the final prescription is that we do not put any portable equipment in this regulation. Portable equipment is handled through the Portable Equipment Registration Program or through a local district permitting process, and it has completely different regulations and completely different requirements for permitting, so it's not part of this regulation. For purposes of understanding the type of equipment, though, so the engine we've defined as it's 25 horsepower and greater than 1 liter displacement, but the type of equipment these engines are used in has to be something called a forklift, or one of the other 3 categories that I mentioned. Now, to define forklift, you've got it on the screen there. A forklift means any electric class 1 or 2 rider truck or an LSI engine powered class 4 or 5 rider truck. And there is an industry association that has the definitions written a little bit longer form than that. But something should be occurring to you right now. And that is, why am I including electrics? You know, what's the issue here? Do electrics actually put out any air pollution that we're concerned with? And obviously the answer would be no, they don't really put out any pollutants. But the reason they're put in this rule as part of the makeup of a fleet that falls under the rule is the fact that it was put in there for an incentive purpose. So this is a fleet average rule, which means at some point we're going to take an emission rate, establish an emission rate for each of the engines that you have that fall under the definitions, and we're going to, it's a straight average. We're going to count up the number of vehicles you have and divide the total emissions, the emission factors, by the number of vehicles, and come up with a single average emission rate. Electric engines will drive that emission rate down and allow you to meet the fleet average emission level a lot faster than if you did not have electric. So from our end of things, it drives the emission rate down, and by your end of things, it incentivizes the use, purchase, and use of electric forklifts. For purposes of this rule, forklift does not mean any of the smaller stuff. I say pallet jacks and walkies. These are things that I'll show you a picture of in just a second that are not actually, if they're electric, you don't need to include them in this rule. And specifically, manless, scissorless, and bucket or boom lifts are exempted from this regulation. Now, here's some examples, images, if you will, of the type of vehicles and forklifts that don't really qualify to be under this regulation. You can see they're fairly small. They're not the class to 2 or 3 or 1 or 2 electrics. These are termed walkies, or the ones that you just stand on, but they're very small in comparison to the ones that we're putting under this rule. So I wanted to make sure everybody was aware that those do not have to be reported. Now, the other 3 type of vehicles that are in this rule are, first of all, something called a tow tractor. And a tow tractor in this rule is an industrial tow tractor. It can have an electric or LSI engine, and it has to be a Class 6 truck as defined by an International Truck Association. This is more or less a forklift without forks. It either pushes things or pulls things, but it doesn't lift and move things. They're used in a number of different ways in a number of different industrial operations, and these are commonly referred to as tow motors or tugs. You will most commonly, I'm sure everybody has seen this at some point, seen one like the one that's pictured, where it is at an airport. They use them to move the planes out onto the tarmac before they take off. Now, because it's at an airport, it'll fall under the GSE definition, but in general, if it's that kind of vehicle running an LSI engine, it's going to be under the LSI rule. Now, I'm also want to show you some, or make a differentiation between some of the other types of tow vehicles that are out there. You've got some characteristics of tow tractors or industrial tractors, but I want you to focus on the pictures that are in front of you right now. The first is an actual obvious one. It's an industrial tractor. If that thing had forks on it, you would know and look to say it was a forklift. So that one is definitely in the rule. The one on the far right is a yard tractor. Now, there's some interesting things going on here. That particular yard tractor was designed to be what's more or less called a goat, a yard goat. These are not meant for on-road driving, and although they look like a little miniature tractor rig, they are not really on-road vehicles, but they do and are defined as a tow tractor under this regulation. Now, if you had one of these that was a retired semi-tractor rig, first of all, it's probably going to be diesel, so it's definitely not under this regulation. But let's say you had a retired semi-tractor rig that ran on some other fuel, like natural gas or gasoline, and you were using it as a yard goat. Because that vehicle was actually designed to be ran on-road, registered on-road, and it has an on-road certified engine, that falls under the on-road category for any regulatory purposes. So it definitely would not fall under this regulation if that was the type of vehicle you had. The last one, the straddle carrier in the middle. Now, if we go by our definition, it's at least 25 horsepower, greater than 1 liter displacement. It's some kind of tow tractor. It doesn't run on diesel. It meets all those definitions. The problem we have here is that this particular one is working at a port for an intermodal rail yard, and it is moving containers. Because those things are true, it falls under a cargo handling limitation that was put in place prior to this particular rule. So it does not fall under this rule and is granted an exemption from this rule. Doesn't mean it's not regulated, it just doesn't fall under this particular rule. The sweeper scrubber definition is shown now. And what I really like to call these things is a concrete Zamboni. They're used in interior industrial operations to clean floors. They sweep it, they vacuum, they scrub, they do all kinds of stuff. And the ones that fall under this rule are generally going to be the ones that are rider trucks. There's lots of these out there that are pushed from behind, two-handled with a big motor on them that just float on the floor and do polishing of that kind of thing. But those are too small to fall under this regulation. Then finally, we have airport ground support equipment. This is an interesting one because airports and rail yards are treated differently than almost any other area that we have that has air regulation, and there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, generally these locations handle interstate commerce. So that means they have vehicles that are crossing state boundaries. And whenever that happens, there's a strong impetus to put the requirements under federal control rather than state control. Unfortunately for the airports, there are a number of types of vehicles that are shown in the listing right there that never really go off the airport, so they never go out of state. And because of that, we decided that we needed to include those in this regulation. Now, to get there, we had to go through something called a memorandum of understanding, because the airports do have federal control over them. And since we were able to do that, a memorandum of understanding is nothing more than a contract between us and the federal government and the airports to allow us to regulate these types of vehicles that are in our state. So when we did this, we had to define exactly what we were regulating, and that's why this list is here. So it's everything on this list, and it includes some on-road equivalent pieces that are designed for on-road or not licensed for it, so we're including them in as a GSE, and they do fall into this regulation. Now, the counting of electrics in the GSE and the LSI rule and the off-road diesel regulation depends on when the vehicle is purchased. There is a possibility of counting electrics in two different rules, or two parts of this rule and the off-road regulation. You're going to want to contact staff if you have some of those vehicles, if you're an airport and you have that kind of vehicle. It's not super common, but that's why it says contact program staff for details. And in fact, Angie, who's here with me today, is one of the staff people that I would turn you to contact. You want to say hi, Angie? Hi. She didn't say hi very, very loud, but she did say it. Anyway, there is in this regulation also some requirements, or at least definitions, for agricultural crop preparation services, and you've got a listing right there. I want to say about these particular operations that the way the rule is written and the requirements within the rule, most of the use of these vehicles at these locations is going to be exempt. And I've got the outline here of what the operations include, and it also includes fire force operations. They're going to be exempt for most of the time under this regulation. There's some more information on the crop preparation services and the agricultural provisions, what is required. But again, I don't know that I can stress it enough. It's almost without exception that if it's being used in an ag operation, it's going to be exempt from this regulation. There are some forklift emission limitations that are also part of the ag crop preparation services. Again, you can see them on the screen there, but because most of these devices are going to be exempt, it's probably not applicable to most people in the audience. Let's talk about equipment dealers, because there are some special provisions under this rule as far as dealers are concerned. Now, when I say dealers, I'm talking about an operation that either rents, leases, or sells LSI equipment. So they're going to have two types of vehicles at these locations. They're going to have those vehicles that are part of their operational fleet, which means they're rented, they're leased, or they're being sold. And they're also going to have some vehicles that are used to service their own fleets and service their own operation. So anything that's part of their operations fleet is exempt from this regulation. They don't have to report it, they don't have to label it, they don't have to, it doesn't become part of any fleet average, it's just exempt. And especially unless it's used, anything, let's see, in the fleet calculations, they have to include all their service equipment, so that's any piece of equipment that is used more than 50% of the time to support their operation. If it's less than half the time, and if they're smart, they'll make it less than half the time, then it's exempt from, even the service equipment is exempt. Operations equipment can also be used for service, and if it goes over 50 hours per year used for service of the operation, then it does have to be included in the fleet calculations. But if you look at this logically, So in order for an equipment dealer to have to do anything with their fleet, they just make sure that their service equipment is used less than 50% of the time to support their leasing operation, and that their operations equipment isn't used at all or less than 50 hours per year. Now, I know some of you in the audience are probably renting or leasing equipment. There's a provision here that I'll talk about in just a few moments that deals with that, and it also will cover some of the stuff we just hit here. There are some exemptions in this rule that you need to be aware of, and this is probably going to knock a bunch of people out of the requirement. The first thing is whether or not your fleet is big enough to even be included. So by definition in this rule, a small fleet is 3 or fewer forklifts and or 3 or fewer pieces of non-forklift LSI equipment. So if you have 3 forklifts and that's all you own, and that includes your electrics, then you're exempt from this regulation. You don't have to report, you don't have to register, you don't have to label. If you have 3 forklifts and you have 3 non-forklift LSI pieces of equipment, including electrics, so you have 3 forklifts and 3 tow tractors, you have 6 vehicles, but because it's an and/or, you're still exempt. You're still considered a small fleet because it's categorized by the type of vehicle. So 3 or fewer of the forklifts, 3 or fewer pieces of non-forklift equipment. So you could technically have 6 pieces and be exempt. I'm going to go one level more though, because let's say you had 4 forklifts and 2 non-forklifts. You still have 6 vehicles, but because your forklift fleet went over the 3, then your forklift fleet is part of the regulation, while your non-forklift fleet is not part of the regulation. So it can get a little bit tricky. But just off the top, if anybody in the audience has 3 or less of this kind of equipment that meets the definitions I went over, you're pretty much done with us. You don't have to report, register, label, or anything. But you do need to make sure you include all the electrics that are part of your fleet as well. We had somebody in the class not that long ago that had over 100 pieces of equipment. More than 90 of them, let's say 99 out of 100, were electrics. They had 1 non-electric. They're in the rule because we're counting their electrics as pieces of equipment. So I told you I'd talk about the rental or lease equipment, and here's the way this works. First of all, I told you that the dealers don't really have any responsibility. Now, they can report, register, and label their equipment, even though they're not technically required to under most circumstances, and that might be something they do for customer service. But if you rent or lease a piece of equipment, the only thing you need to be worried about as to whether it falls under this rule is the term of your agreement and how many days per year you might use that piece of equipment. So if you rent a leased piece of equipment and not for 30 or fewer days, and that's aggregate days in a year, then it's exempt. You don't have to report it. If you rent it or lease it for more than 30 days in a year, then you do have to include it as part of your fleet as long as you have that piece of equipment. So it's interesting examples to go over here. Number one, let's say you have an open-ended contract with a rental company for this type of equipment. That's actually fairly common. So you call the company up and you say, I need a forklift for a couple of weeks. They send one over to you, and you have that thing for 14 days. Well, that's under 30, so it's exempt. You do not have to report that. Let's say a couple months later, you call the same rental company up and say, listen, I need another forklift for another 2 weeks. Well, that's 28 total days. Even if they sent you the exact same piece of equipment, which they would have to do to make it qualify, you're still under the 30. But if you then again ordered it later in that same year for another 2-week period or any time period longer than that, you've gone over the 30 days, but only if it's the exact same piece of equipment. So if they sent you forklift A the first time, and then they sent you forklift B the second time, and then forklift C the third time, as long as there was no point that you had any of those forklifts for more than 30 days, you do not have a reporting, registration, or labeling requirement. I know several people I've talked to that actually work this into their rental lease agreements, so they don't have to deal with it. I also know several dealer operators or dealerships that are registering, labeling, and reporting all of their equipment for 2 reasons. One, I said earlier, customer service, and 2, they have several customers that are actually telling them in their contracts that they will not rent equipment that is not registered and labeled. So you might see any of that happen. If you have any vehicles that fall under the ag crop preparation services, they are exempt from the regulation, as I said earlier. And then military tactical support equipment has been exempt from this regulation, as well as many of our other ones for quite some time. So we've got the what's and exemptions, the who's, the what. So what's in and what's out, what's not, what's good. Now you need to know what the requirements are under this rule. And the basic requirement for this rule is fleet average. So once you determine that you have equipment that falls under the definition, you need to separate your fleet into two different fleets. It's either forklift or non-forklift. So you have all your forklifts on one side, all your non-forklifts on the other. For each, you have to include the individual electric pieces of equipment as part of your fleet. And as I said before, if there's 1 to 3 of any category, you're exempt. But if you have 4 to 25, you're considered a medium fleet, and I'll show you the numbers in just a second. Anything more than 25, you're considered large. When you do this counting, you're supposed to use something called fleet aggregation. And fleet aggregation means that you have to add together into a single fleet all the, all the fleets that are under common control at a higher corporate level. So the example would be Home Depot. There's probably more than 100 Home Depots in the state of California. Each of them might have 1 or 2 forklifts. So individually, they could technically be exempt if they were a fleet unto themselves. But because they have higher corporate ownership, they have to add all the forklifts at all the Home Depots in California to determine what size fleet they are and what their requirement is. Most likely they're going to be a large fleet, but still, that's the way they would have to do it. If you have the situation where you are owned at a higher corporate level, but there is absolutely no connection to any of the other locations, there is a possibility you can separate yourself out as an individual fleet. But I'm going to tell you, you need to talk to staff here at ARB before you do that. And once it's reported in the system one way, it's a little difficult to change it. So make sure you get it right before you put it in the system. Here are the fleet averages that your fleets have to meet. And as I said before, it's an average emission level in grams of hydrocarbon plus NOx per kilowatt hour or brake horsepower hour. So kilowatt hour is used here because a lot of the labels on these pieces of equipment use kilowatts, and your electrics obviously will. But you can see the requirements. Now, there's a couple things that are interesting about this. You should be able to tell there is no date in the future. The last date that there was a requirement is 1/1 of 2013. That's because when we made the modifications to the rule in 2016, we did not change the fleet averages. The fleet averages stayed the same. And if you have a lot of newer equipment, you're never going to have a problem with these fleet averages. Remember, anything 2010 or newer engine meets 0.6 grams per brake horsepower hour or kilowatt hour. So you're easily going to meet these. Now, we look at each individual fleet. So it's the forklift fleet, large and medium, and then the non-forklift fleet. And there's only one requirement for that. So how do we calculate this average? Well, first of all, I told you earlier, and I'll just reiterate this, it is a straight average. Each of your vehicles is reported, and when you report, we need to know the model year of the engine, we need to know the manufacturer, we need to know the horsepower. All that information will give us an emission rate that was set for that engine when it was first certified for sale in the United States by federal EPA. Because that's published information, we know what that information is. We don't necessarily need you to report to us what you think the average emission rates are, because we know what the certification levels are. We will take each of the vehicles you report, assign a emission average, or not emission average, but an emission rate for those engines. Then we will add them all up and we'll divide by the number of vehicles you have to create an average emission rate, and then compare it to this target table. If you don't have your information, complete information, or if you want to know how we assign emission rates. So the emission factors that we assign are based on federal standards. And it can be a problem for people when they're reporting, especially individuals or companies that have older fleets. Because a lot of the older pieces of equipment in this category may not have very good labels. They may not have labels at all. They may have been wiped off or washed off or something happened to them. So it may be very difficult to get the information. So I'm going to tell you right now, this chart here is used by the program, the reporting system, to insert emission factors for your vehicles based on what you report. So if you report anything that was manufactured prior, with an engine manufactured prior to 2001, it doesn't really matter. You're going to get the 16 grams per kilowatt hour or 12 grams per brake horsepower hour emission factor. If it's manufactured between 01 and 03, but it has no controls on it, you're still going to get the same emission factor. If it's 01 to 03, the model year of the engine, and it has controls, then you get 1/4 of the emission, the original emission factor, so 4 grams per kilowatt hour. And if it's an 04 or 06, you get the same 4 grams. Anything 07 to 09 model year engine should be meeting the standard that's up on the screen. And then model 2010 model year, obviously I went over that. Now I've got some labels to show you, so I want to point some things out here. I know this label is a little bit difficult to read. Hopefully everybody can see this, but the label says, this engine conforms to 2001 California regulation for emission non-compliant LSI engines. So first of all, we know what the model year of the engine is. It's a 2001. And we also know that it's not uncontrolled because it says non-compliant. And I'm only going to go back up one time because this is it's difficult to do in a webinar for everybody to pay attention. But on our chart, that is a 2001 uncontrolled. So it's going to get the 16 grams per kilowatt hour or 12 grams per brake horsepower hour inserted as its emission factor. And if you go back up one more time and you look at what the standards are, so the standards for large and medium fleets on forklift side are 1.5 grams per kilowatt hour or 1.1 grams per brake horsepower hour for the large fleets. That's going to be wrecked by anything that has to be put in as a 16 gram per brake horsepower kilowatt hour emission factor. So you don't want that. But that is one of the things you're looking for when you do a report. We want to see these labels. We like the labels. They tell us lots of good information. But because it says non-compliant, we can tell that that meets that 16 grams per kilowatt hour standard. Now here's another engine that is also 2001. But if you look, it has the engine family and it says emission control. Now on this one it says TWC, carb, and then has some numbers after it. So TWC stands for three-way catalyst. That is an emission control device. So on our chart, this particular one is going to get the 4 grams per brake horsepower hour because it has that control. Excuse me. All right, and then finally we've got this one here. This is an 07 engine, and you don't even need to ask what rate it's going to get, because not only does it tell you the model year and the controls and the family name, but it actually gives you the emission rate. Now we're going to use that 0.8 grams per kilowatt hour as your emission factor with this engine. And that's going to be used to calculate your fleet average. An engine like this will only help you, because remember the fleet average requirements were 1.5 and 1.1, or 1.9, sorry, per kilowatt hour. That is, this 0.8 grams is significantly lower than that, so it will drive your average down. All right, so for ground support equipment, airport ground support equipment, there may be a little bit of an issue trying to calculate the fleet average. So you'll have vehicles that are designed for but not the license for on-road operation. There are some examples right there. We're going to insert a average emission rate for you based on the model year of that engine, and you can see what the on-road defaults for the calculations are right there. There are some exclusions that we will not count when we're using or creating the fleet average. The first one would be limited hours of use. Under this regulation, any piece of equipment that you can designate as low use means that you do not use it more than 200 hours per year. And when you report it, it's the previous year's use that we're looking at. As long as it's used less than 200 hours, it can be as old a piece of equipment as you want, have as high emission rate as you want, but it's considered low use and it's not used to calculate your fleet average. Now, there's also an exception in here for rental or lease equipment where you have a short-term agreement and the vehicles meet a particular standard. They can, and they don't meet any more than 20% of your fleet, or you can exclude only the first 20% from the fleet average. Finally, there are some exclusions that deal with a couple of areas that a lot of people are familiar with, but I need to go over them. That's something called boneyard and retired equipment. Boneyards are essentially the pile of old equipment that's gone to die, but you don't want to get rid of it because your mechanic might be able to grab something off of one of those to fix another piece of your fleet. Those pieces of equipment are not going to be used to calculate any fleet average because almost without exception, they are not operational. They do not work. Now, retired, as far as we're concerned, means that you're not using it as part of your active fleet, but it still is intact, and usually this is going to be either because somebody wants to hold it in reserve or they're planning on getting rid of it through sale or some other mechanism. In either the boneyard or the retired case, what we really have an issue with is whether or not the vehicle can be turned on and run. If it can be turned on and run, then we've got a problem. You either need to designate it as low use or we're going to consider it to be part of your fleet. So if you have something that's in the boneyard or something that you're holding on to and it's retired, just make sure that it is disabled in some way. And there's some examples of how to disable it. You can have non-resettable hour meters put in place. You can remove a component that will allow it not to be run. You can employ lockout devices or keep it in a separate location. Any one of those things will be fine when an inspector actually comes to your facility. Now, it is also possible that some people might see the benefit to going the direction of installing a catalyst or a catalytic converter system, and rather than purchasing a whole new piece of equipment or leasing a whole new piece of equipment. So that is part of the regulation. You can install these devices. It will reduce the emission rates that are used in calculating your fleet average. I can't tell you how much it will reduce it because it's based on the certification of the kit that you're using, and that's an important word. It has to be from a kit that was designed and certified to work with your particular engine that you're planning on putting this on. Now, the system that you've got in picture there is something called Blue Cat. That's a fairly popular manufacturer for these kits. They make kits for a lot of different engines. What we're requiring, if you want to use this to reduce your average emission rate and the total emission average you have, we want you to make sure that it's a certified kit, certified for the engine that you're installing it on, and that it's a kit, not just individual components that were taken off of other pieces of equipment that you have. It has to have, as you can see in the picture, it has to have the catalyst, it has to have the little computer, it has to have an O2 sensor, everything has to be intact and it has to be installed properly per the manufacturer's directions. One last thing about these kits, I don't know how many people in the audience are actually going to use something like this, but I will tell you that I've been given information from a couple different dealers and manufacturers that doing a Blue Cat install can range in price anywhere from somewhere around $1,500 up to somewhere around $3,500, depending on the piece of equipment that's being installed in. So that's significantly less than purchasing a new piece of equipment. It might make business sense for you to do this rather than to either buy or lease a new piece. All right, so that's the rule. Hopefully we don't have too many questions there. I want to briefly discuss some of the reporting requirements and show you some examples of the reporting system. We're already past the point by quite a ways as to when people had to have information in this database, but we're still looking for people to report. So the reporting system is going through something called DOORS. If you have off-road equipment, off-road diesel equipment, you should be familiar with the DOORS system. Instead of creating a whole new reporting system for the LSI side of things, because they are also considered off-road, we just incorporated them into the DOORS reporting system. I'll show you a picture of what that looks like in a second, but that means if you have an existing DOORS account, you do not have to create any new one. You'll be able to report all of your LSI and all of your off-road diesel vehicles in the same system. Reporting initially was due January 30th or by January 30th of last year, 2017. So we're more than a year past when the initial reporting was due. The regulation requires you to report changes to your fleet within 30 days, and those changes could be anything like a sale, purchase, or retrofit, or any ownership status change, or maybe you repowered the engine. Anything that modifies or possibly modifies your fleet average needs to be reported. Now, people ask me sometimes, is that really important to do it every 30 days? And honestly, we're not going to come out and check you. You know, we're not. The system takes your information as you report it. It doesn't verify that what you're saying is actually what exists in real life. We believe that you have the equipment, but here's what happens is if you don't report changes, and we have an inspector in your area that comes to take a look at your fleet, he's going to look at what's out there in your yard or in your operation, and then he's going to compare it to what's in the reporting system. And if those two things don't match, then there are going to be questions and most likely a citation because of a reporting issue. There might also be equipment citations. But at minimum, we want you to come in once a year, and that's for annual reporting, and report what your fleet is for that year. You need to do something called an attestation, which is similar to the ROAR form for the off-road diesel. It is now electric or electronic, right? Yeah, so there is an electronic version of the attestation for this regulation as well. So you do that. You also need to report hour meter readings, and there is no different schedule depending on size of fleet. Everybody has until June 30th each year to report their fleets. All right, so what kind of vehicles have to be reported? Well, obviously, if you have a vehicle that is subject to the fleet average emission level. So again, anything that's a forklift or a tow tractor or a sweeper or a ground support equipment that is at least 25 horsepower, greater than 1 liter displacement, and LSI. That is what we're looking for, including electrics. We also want you to report your low-use vehicles. Otherwise, we have no idea that they're low use. If you have any specialty equipment, and I really can't tell you what that is, because that's stuff that you have to deal with ARB staff to determine whether or not it can be considered specialty equipment. But it does have a place in the reporting system to be designated as specialty. If you happen to be lucky enough to be part of a program where they're experimenting with an emission control device and using your equipment for that experimentation, we'd like to know that you have vehicles like that and what the equipment is. And again, the crop preparation service vehicles are exempt. This is the kind of information we're looking for. Obviously, we need to know the operator's name with the address, all that good stuff. All the equipment that falls under the rule, LSI engines and zero emission, as well as any retrofitted engines, all need to be reported as long as you have more than 3. Remember, if you have 3 or fewer, you don't do any of this. All right. How do you get to the reporting system? Well, there's lots of different ways to get to this reporting system. The page that I have on the screen is called the truck stop. And this is the page that was created several years ago by some of the younger staff at our agency that grew up with the internet. And the way it's presented, the links that are in place, that's much easier to navigate than anything else we have. If you go to the truck stop, you can go right to the reporting tab on the top. It's a drop-down menu, and the very bottom of that drop-down menu, it says off-road. You click on that, it's going to take you to the DOORS reporting system. You could also go to the page that's a sister page of the truck stop. It's called the off-road zone, and there's the web address. It also has the same kind of setup, a little bit different coloring because it's obviously a different page, but there's several places where you can get to the reporting system. On this page alone, right now, I see 3 different places. You've got the drop-down menu up top, you've got the Getting Started tab, hold on just a second, and then you've also got the Regulations and Reporting. All right, we have a question, so let's stop for just a minute.
There's a question saying, are rail car movers included in any of the diesel regulations?
Rail car movers. Todd had that discussion with somebody there because it's on rails, so it doesn't, if it runs on diesel, if it runs on diesel, it might be part of the off-road regulation. It's not going to be part of this one.
Yeah, but if it's in a rail yard, it won't. Because it will be part of the...
It's not part of the MOU. It might be considered a train, though.
Yeah, that's the
problem. Okay, which is exempt from off-road. Yeah. So I guess the question, we're kind of talking back and forth here to answer your question. First, what fuel does it operate on? If it runs on diesel, then you don't have a requirement of that because rail vehicles, trains and such are exempt from the off-road regulation because of interstate commerce regulations. If it runs on gas, CNG, or something like that, I still believe you're probably going to be exempt from the regulation, but I'd have to look into it myself.
Yeah. If they should have emailed the doors.
Yeah, we should have said that to begin with. If we can't answer a question today in this class and it occurs to you, you've got, it's doors@arb.ca.gov. So DOORS@arb.ca.gov. If you ship us an email, we've got several staff people that are capable of determining the correct answer. And if it can't be done immediately, Angie's one of the staff people that is responsible for going through and making determinations like that. So we'll get you an answer.
Yeah, we can talk to staff.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, anyway, back to the reporting. I've kind of gone over the 2 pages. We don't really like paper reporting, so we don't really promote that. There are paper forms associated with these regulations. They can be found on the off-road diesel vehicle page because it's doors, but there's also a doors login right there. This is what it should look like, or something similar to this when you actually open up doors, the actual login screen. It allows you to create an account. It allows you to log in. It allows you to get your username and password if you've lost them. And then it gives you some reporting information for fleet reporting. Once you're in your account, I'm not going to say you're going to have as many different fleets or ID numbers as this one. This is a test account that we use just to make a point. So because we're encapsulating both LSI and diesel off-road equipment in one reporting system, we had to do something to make sure that you could easily tell and we could easily tell. So we color-coded everything. And I apologize to those people that are colorblind because you probably don't see the differentiation between these colors. This happens to be that they're the colors people are most usually colorblind to. Green and blue are two of the colors that drive people nuts.
But it does say LSI or off-road.
Yeah, so go with the text. In this case, for those that can see it, the cyan or blue color is the designation for LSI fleets, and anything in the light green or mint color is a designation for off-road. You can have multiple fleets in a single account. I know several people that do that. When you create an account, it will pop up in your Doors ID list, and the name of the account is actually a link to take you to that account. So we have one LSI fleet in this image here. We click on where it says test space dash space LSI testing fleet, and it should bring us to this screen, which will give us a picture of the equipment that we have. Now, there's lots of different things that you can look at here. There's a message center. There's a place to look at owner information, the equipment. This is an equipment list. So there's also drop-down menus there where you can add equipment. One of the things that I want everybody to do, if you haven't done this already within your Doors account, and this is for both the off-road diesel as well as the LSI side, there is a tool in your account called Compliance Snapshot. And the Compliance Snapshot is going to start out looking for LSI. It's going to look like this, where it gives you a look at what we see. It'll tell you what your fleet average is. It'll tell you how many forklifts you have. It'll tell you whether or not you're in compliance, your fleet size, what your average emission rate is. It gives you an idea of everything that we see as part of your fleet. It also will break it down for you in the calculation details so that you can take a look and see exactly what we're looking at. Finally, if you want to do a mass import or export, that is possible in the system. So we have an Excel spreadsheet that we've created, and it matches all of these same columns that the reporting system has. And you can take that offline, put your information in there about your fleet, and then import that en masse into your Doors account. You can also export, if you've already entered some information in and just want to make changes on the Excel spreadsheet, you can do that. You can export the entire thing to a Microsoft Excel file and then use that to make your updates. You need to be aware of a couple different things. Well, the first and probably the most important is that when you import the Excel spreadsheet, it overwrites your existing account, all the information, and it doesn't append. So be careful, make sure that what's in there is exactly what you want to have as part of your doors fleet, because it's going to override everything. This Excel spreadsheet is not a fleet calculator. We have a fleet calculator for the off-road diesel vehicle regulation. This is just a simple spreadsheet that meets our column nomenclature. The second thing you need to be aware of is, because it meets our column nomenclature, don't do what I've had a couple of people tell me they did. So I had a couple different students in classes where they told me they downloaded the spreadsheet. They already had a spreadsheet, but it wasn't organized the same way. So instead of modifying theirs to meet our organization, they modified our columns so that it met their organization. Then they imported the data in with a different column set, and it just inserted it in the wrong places. So it's kind of a mess. You got to go back and fix everything, and most likely you're going to have to deal with staff and trying to fix that out. But still, be aware that this is a tool for you to use. It does have its tremendous upsides, but there's also some issues you want to make sure you pay attention to. All right, so if you want more information on the regulation and the process, we do have an LSI webpage that's in our standard pages that's outside of the off-road zone or truck stop. It looks like this, lots and lots of links. This one is a little bit more difficult to navigate, but it certainly is available if you want to take a look at it. All right, labeling. The whole reason that this regulation has come up recently. With the 2016 amendments, you're required to register, as I said. When you register, each of your vehicles is going to be given a designated equipment identification number, or EIN. Now, within 30 days of getting that designation, or that EIN, you're required to get a label and put it on the vehicle, somewhere on the vehicle. There's only required to have one label, unlike the off-road rule where we want the label on each side of the vehicle. For the LSI, we just want one label. A couple things about this label. Number one, there are size specs and color specs that you have to pay attention to. So the lettering is supposed to be a minimum of 3-inch high block lettering. It has to be white, and it has to be on a red background. For purposes of the LSI rule, we're only requiring one label because the locations where a lot of this equipment will be are inside, and we're going to have to come inside to see it, so we don't need labels on both sides. The primary purpose of the labels for off-road vehicles is because we want to do what are called drive-by inspections or off-site inspections, where we don't actually come onto your property to do the inspection, so we're not stopping your business operation. If we cannot see the label from that location, we do have to stop your operation. The second, or I guess third or fourth thing about these labels is you want to make sure that you put it in a place that's visible and it won't get scraped or rubbed off. I had somebody in a class not that long ago that said that they incorrectly installed their labels on their propane tanks. And the problem with that is propane tanks come off, get refilled, and they get put on different vehicles. That's going to be a complete mess. Other people I've heard installed on the mast or the cage or someplace that it's not going to change. I wouldn't put it necessarily on the side where your operators can, smash into things and rub it off. And the last thing about these labels is that if you ever get rid of a piece of equipment that you've registered, you don't take the label off. The label and the number go with that vehicle for the life of that vehicle. So just make sure that it doesn't come off. You just keep it. All right, so there are some transfer and sale requirements. So I said this earlier, when you make a change to your fleet, you're required to come in within 30 days and you enter all the information about the modifications to your fleet. If you have something with an hour meter reading, like a low use piece of equipment, we're going to ask you for the final hour meter reading. And the main reason for that is if whoever purchases that piece of equipment also brings it in, they're going to start with a meter reading, and it's got to be somewhat close to what the thing finished with when you let it go. If you don't transfer or retire the vehicle from your doors account when you sell it, then the person who's purchasing that piece of equipment will not be able to add that to their fleet until that transfer is, or that retired designation is put on your account. So make sure you do that, and that's so that it works on both ends. Okay, for record keeping, the records that I talked about that we were asking you to report, you know, like the vehicle make, engine serial number, all that kind of stuff, this rule requires that to be kept for 5 years after the date of reporting. We don't need fuel quality records anymore. That was an early requirement in one of the iterations of the rule, but it's not there anymore. And one big difference between this rule's record-keeping requirements and a lot of other rules is that we don't need the records to be kept with the vehicle itself, or even at the same facility that the vehicle is used in. They can be kept at a centralized location or headquarters, as long as if an inspector or an auditor asks for them, they are given to them within a reasonable period of time. And we generally define reasonable period of time as to be, you know, 7 to 10 business days. All right, so enforcement. Enforcement, we have been able to enforce this rule since 2012. We actually haven't done any enforcement until somewhere in the 2017 timeframe. Our enforcement division has an enforcement plan that includes LSI enforcement, and they have been going out and doing that. They can be conducted by just one inspector or a set of inspectors. Maybe even the local district inspectors will be brought in. That happens fairly regularly on some of these industrial locations. We won't just inspect one type of thing. If you have forklifts at your site, as well as off-road diesel vehicles, or cargo handling equipment, or mobile source or stationary source devices, most likely if there's an enforcement action, we will be looking at all those things. The maximum penalty associated with this particular rule for a non-compliant piece of equipment is $500 per day. Generally, if you do get a citation, it's not going to be on a per-day basis, though. The Enforcement Division of the Air Resources Board actually operates on a scale that says so much per month. And the last time I checked, that was somewhere either $1,000 or $1,500 per month. All right. So that's all the information except for the contact and resources. So we have a hotline. We have staff that answer the hotline. There's the number. We also have an email associated with them. They can give you DOOR's technical help as well as regulatory information. So you've got this in the handout that I set aside as part of the webinar. The information is there for you to use at any point. Now the hotline is staffed by, is there like 6 people there now? Or?
No, right now it's
only 2 people. Wow, we lost a couple of them.
But we just got new people. We got 2 new ones that are in training right now.
Okay.
So they'll be on the phone soon. All
right, good. So we have 2 regular phone answers and 2 more coming online, which suggests to me that you might want to send the email first. If you don't need an answer immediately, it might be better if you sent an email. But either way is fine. We'll take the questions and we'll answer whatever we can. You can also go to the website. Most often you can find information there, the off-road zone, that you need. It'll give you guidance documents, the actual regulation, and give you some executive orders for any retrofits. That's what the off-road zone looks like in the area where we're talking about LSI, and there's lots of really good links for that. Now, I got to change this picture because I don't think it looks like this anymore. But one of the mechanisms that I use to advertise classes, and hopefully all of you that are online right now got an email from me at some point or from the off-road system, the DOOR system, because we use emails a lot. And we have something called listservs. This is I guess it used to be the listserv where you could join a listserv. The new one is a little bit more modern looking, but in any case, you can join a listserv for lots of different kinds of information at the ARB. First and foremost, any regulation has its own listserv. Training has a listserv. I would like as many people to join that as possible because I send a notification out on a monthly basis for all the upcoming trainings, including webinars. And that's all the information we had in the training this afternoon. I told you it'd take about an hour. I think I'm right on task. Does anybody have any additional questions? We'll hold out for a few minutes. I'm going to put the phone on mute. And if you have a question, I'll bring it back off and we will talk it over. But I'm going to put my timer up here so that, let's see, let's go 5. All right, when that thing gets to 0, we're going to close out the webinar.